Hi all, in this video we're going to talk about economic agents, households and firms, and which is our starting point. What is striking is the commonality of human sentiments across the world, and how similarly those households and firms behave in their interaction with each other and with government. Sympathy seems to be a natural human characteristic, and it's pretty rare for people to be of entirely unsympathetic in nature. Maybe a politician seeking election might venture into that territory, but in our economic interactions, it's really very rare, and firms tend to have a natural consideration for the welfare of their customers, simply because they want their customers to order and reorder their goods. And similarly, households tend to look to trusted names among firms. And in seeking redress for grievances and griefs, common interaction is very similar across the globe. When things go wrong, a very similar process of sharing information and establishing redress takes place. And that's across cultures, geographies, historical eras. We can read literature going back thousands of years, which sounds awfully similar. So the core architecture of economic life rests not so much on money. Money is what grabs people's attention, but this shared foundation and this exchange and this trust, which takes advantage of the fact that human nature is remarkably constant. So the micro units of society, households and firms, respond to the world in predictable ways. There's a need for praise and praiseworthiness, and ironically, even particularly in government, that is particularly the case. And the case study that we're going to have goes back 2 centuries to the invention of the photographic process and the way the French government, just as the governments today do with big technologies, shared that technology to the common good. It's benevolence, as opposed to justice in a way. In that the inventor of that process could have, in the modern era, could have joined the era of the billionaires and done well. But by the same token, when it comes to climate change and electric vehicles, considerable amounts of proprietary technology have been shared by firms, which admittedly they may have thought that was preferable to espionage, but that is a factor. This idea of praise and praiseworthiness is an idea. Similarly, something that you'll hear a lot in households and firms and in practice is prudence and self-interest. Firms tend to be prudent in their conduct, in their investment outlays, and households tend to be rational in their self-interest and conduct. Firms tend to be rational in their self-interest and aim to cover their costs, because otherwise, unless they recover those outlays and make a profit or at least no loss, they will go out of business. So prudence and self-interest, another factors. Another factor that you'll hear is almost like a stick of rock: confidentiality and trust, and contracts, and how that is very much part of business life. Once you say you're going to do something and reduce it to writing, you're expected to observe that, even if self-interest dictates otherwise. So when relative prices rise, consumers everywhere economize. When profit opportunities emerge, entrepreneurs take risks. Sympathy, something that Adam Hume wrote about in his theory of moral sentiments, which is almost like the mirror image of the Wealth of Nations. I mean, if you read the Wealth of Nations without the bedrock of the theory of moral sentiments, then you may not be talking about the same agents as Adam Smith. And often that's in discussions and disagreements, often a fundamental difference in the nature of the agent and their motivation. It can become evident, particularly when there are court proceedings. It can seem sometimes, as Adam Smith described, there can be self-delusion and an inability to distinguish between short-term, the long-term, and the present, which affects business and affects markets. And Adam Smith introduced this idea of he described it as the impartial spectator. So, almost like the judge on your shoulder, that the idea that people are perfectly capable of judging the circumstances and judging their economic behavior simply because they observe other people's economic behavior and have a pretty clear idea from those observations exactly what the rules should be, which is very helpful. This shared psychological basis is very much how we look at it, springs from very much how we look at the world, and how we are impartial observers. Adam Smith's often cited as self-interest, leave it to the market, and so on. But pure selfishness destroys the trust needed for sustained exchange, and an element of altruism does come in, an element of sense of duty does come in, and you'll encounter that when you go out to firms. You will see firms who are very dedicated in what they do and very good at what they do. Like all firms, they have a life cycle, and nothing is forever. But at its best, at its height, economic activity is not only rewarding, but personally satisfying. And people love to be in a job. In the UK, there's some 33 million people in jobs. I mean, it's remarkable. One of the simplifying assumptions that we make is that people prize their leisure time and would rather have leisure time than work. But people do like to work, and leisure time without the ability to enjoy it in terms of income, um, is not obviously attractive. Um, so fairness norms, um, it sort of overcomes sort of opportunism, which pushes the boundaries. The markets provide a social fabric. Households and firms meet in this market, and their behaviour, just again, there seem to be universal patterns to their behaviour when they consider price and scarcity. The household evaluates the trade-offs at the margin, and it substitutes away from dear goods. My favourite is apples and pears because they are substitutes, and as in economics, economists tend to talk, even in complicated matters, not unobvious matters like comparative advantage. We'll talk of two countries and two products as a way of understanding what's going on before you venture out to 247 countries and millions of products. And it pretty well works. We know that where goods like apples and pears are substitutes, the household will move away from relatively dear goods, and the firms will reallocate their outlays, their capital and their labour towards higher margin goods. So the shared mechanism is how we look at price and scarcity. Trust and contracts, households will prefer firms with proven reputations for fair dealing, and the firms will invest in brand capital. Branding's terribly important to firms, and repeated customer goodwill. Labour, the household behaviour is to withhold effort under perceived injustice or unfair wages. Such things, such penalties, are pretty unfashionable. And if anything, when we come to deal with HMRC, HMRC talk in terms of nudges to get the household and the firm to part with their hard-earned money. But of course, the penalties are there as a backstop. The firm's normal behaviour, it offers a high level of efficiency and incentives to maintain morale and retention. So an essential fairness in the same way that in trust and contracts, you have that reciprocity of equal standing and being treated equally. So exchange is really a purely a clearing mechanism of equations and so on. If we think of our simplified example of going to the market, it can be as little as uncomplex as how are the sales going? Have we got a shortage of goods? Have we got a surplus? If we've got a surplus, do we need to do something about the price within the day to clear the market? These across millions of products, these signals and these actions and reactions, all in relation to incentives, happen. Um, um, Adam Smith calls it an invisible hand, but again, I think this is open to misinterpretation. For the invisible hand to work, there has to be a commonality, a common humanity, for the invisible hand to work. Um, uh, there are other ways of behaving, which Adam Smith goes into great detail about in the theory of moral sentiments, and which is well worth a read. So I hope that's been a little bit of, as we get into the areas of tax compliance, and how everyone's behaving, how governments are going about their tax revenues, how they're going about controlling their expenditure fairly, while at the same time providing those core services of defence, welfare, education, and transport. The essential infrastructure of markets, as well as innovation. And as I said, we started this with this case study of France making the photographic process available to all immediately, so as much of the world could take advantage of this way of evidencing, this way of art, this way of capturing reality and agreeing on reality, to the benefit of all. So I hope that gives a little overview as to how all the actors, households, firms, align with these underlying moral sentiments and incentives, and how in doing so they generate wealth, social peace, and innovation. When institutions fight this basic human nature, the result can be stagnation and decay, and where there is inequity, where an economy has generated huge rewards and that's become concentrated in a few hands, and those few hands then start to defend their grip, then you get into stagnation and decay, and almost inevitably war. And if it's one thing that Adam Smith said, the most destructive element of the wealth of nations is war. So there we go. Bye for now, and see you next time.